Welcome to the Life Academy and our conversation about the greatest of our times. I'm Doug Pratt, joining you to offer a Christian perspective on the remarkable times in which we've lived over the past century, or at least that our grandparents or parents have lived through. We have considered first the greatest saints of the past century, a man and a woman whose lives were so exemplary and completely dedicated as followers of Christ that they shine on beyond their deaths as incredible role models. Then we looked at what I consider to be the two greatest, that is, most influential, Christian books written in the last 100 years. In this episode, we will identify the two greatest leaders of our times. First, a disclaimer. We will not be considering anyone from the past couple decades because we're too close to those years and not able to be as objective as an accurate assessment requires. You cannot write history while you are living it. Only in hindsight can we come close to seeing things with an unbiased perspective. And of course, even knowing how certain events have played out doesn't remove all bias from human observers. Only God sees everything and can make the perfect and infallible judgment on the efforts, the successes, and the failures of the past. We are thinking about the task of leadership, which is the absolutely most important element in any corporate human enterprise, from empires and nations to companies to churches to families. Because leadership is so crucial and because it comes in so many different forms and is exercised for good or ill in so many different circumstances, many thinkers and researchers have been drawn to examine it. One approach to evaluating leaders is to see them on a spectrum or continuum from one extreme or pole to the opposite. Certain situations require a command form of leader, the classic example being the military. The other extreme is persuasion leadership. And speaking as a pastor of over 45 years, almost all leadership in a church is of this kind, because a church is a volunteer organization and people will only serve it if motivated to do so. Another pair of opposites that has been suggested contrasts statesmen to revolutionaries. Statesman leadership is best when a situation is stable or healthy and needs continuity, while revolutionaries are the epitome of dramatic change agents to shake up or redirect. In a similar vein, some leaders utilize what's been labeled executive leadership, while others go to the opposite pole of legislative leadership. This helps to explain why some politicians who have been effective in Congress, working for compromise and consensus, have been less effective as presidents, and why some presidents with an extreme executive style haven't been successful in working with legislatures. America, in its 250 years, has had in its military and government a few truly great leaders, a number of mediocre leaders, and a few who were disastrously ineffective. The bell curve applies. We've also seen many dedicated Christian leaders who have faithfully tried to live out biblical principles while applying to the complicated real world. Some have led large corporations. I can mention former CEOs Steve Reinemund of Pepsi, Ralph Larson of Johnson & Johnson, Coleman Mockler of Gillette, and Tom Phillips of Raytheon. Some Christian leaders have founded and run private companies, such as Truett Cathy of Chick-fil-A and David Green of Hobby Lobby. Parenthetically, in some ways, it's easier to manage a public company because you have lots of shareholder money to work with, but it's also harder because you have to deal with those often demanding shareholders and markets. We have seen many great Christian leaders in nonprofits, Christian ministries, and churches. Bob Pierce of World Vision, Ken Starr of Young Life, Tori Johnson of Youth for Christ, Bill Bright of Campus Crusade, Billy and Franklin Graham of their ministries, Bill Hybels of Willow Creek, Wes Stafford of Compassion, Gary Haugen of IJM, all of them visionaries for the kingdom of Christ. We've seen Christian leaders in athletics, including coaches Jim Tressel, Mark D'Antonio, Lou Holtz, and Joe Gibbs. But my focus for the challenge of choosing the two greatest leaders of our times is to look only at those who have been the leaders of large democratic nations in times of critical challenge and conflict. I am limiting the consideration to national leaders really for two reasons. First, because they have the hardest job of all, convincing millions of people to vote for them and then leading their countries through all difficulties. And secondly, because their leadership can have the greatest impact on the most people, not only within their borders, but in the broader world. Having chosen the two greatest leaders and assessing their lives and their qualities, we will finally consider from a Christian perspective what might have been their spiritual foundations. In my judgment, the two greatest leaders of 20th century democracies were Winston Churchill, who lived 1875 to 1965, and Ronald Reagan, who lived 1911 to 2004. The primary criteria for selecting these two is that they were instrumental, even essential and irreplaceable to the winning of the two greatest victories of that century. There were actually three great world-encompassing conflicts in the 20th century: World Wars I and II and the Cold War. The First World War didn't really result in a clear victory. It ended essentially in exhaustion, revolution, economic depression, and the rise of totalitarianism. In a very real sense, we could consider the First and Second World Wars as actually one war with a two-decade interruption or tense ceasefire. The absolutely indispensable person without whom at the exact right place and time the Allies would not have been able to win the Second World War in 1945 or possibly ever was Winston Churchill. Though the American leader Roosevelt and the Soviet leader Stalin ultimately had very important roles, if it had not been for Churchill rallying the United Kingdom against a victorious Nazi Germany in 1940, history would have been very different. The final world conflict of the 20th century was the Cold War. Incredibly, it was won by the West in the early 1990s without the nuclear conflagration that was possible. And although the Soviet leader Gorbachev was a significant figure in the eventual collapse from within of the USSR, in large part unintentionally, and although the actual fall of the Berlin Wall and dissolution of the Soviet Empire came after his retirement, yet Ronald Reagan was indisputably the driving force behind the victory. The world we know today would be radically altered without his leadership. Short biographies. Winston Churchill was born into an upper-class home a decade after the American Civil War to a British politician and his American wife. He had a difficult childhood, with his parents emotionally distant. He had a love of adventure and a love of writing and scholarship. After college, he served in the British Army in India and Sudan. Then he became a newspaper correspondent and covered the Boer War in South Africa, where he was imprisoned and then made a dramatic escape. He wrote several history books as a young man and then entered the family business of politics, serving in Parliament and the cabinet. His career hit a major crisis point during the First World War when he, as Admiralty Lord, equivalent of our Secretary of the Navy, sponsored a disastrous invasion of Turkey that failed and cost him his job. In the between-war years, he was relegated to more minor positions in government, but as Hitler rose to power in Germany and began to rearm and prepare for a resumption of war, Churchill was one of the few voices in Britain who were raising alarm and appealing for military rebuilding. The British government under Neville Chamberlain tried again and again to appease the Nazis, only adding to Hitler's aggression. When the Blitzkrieg swept across Western Europe and France was about to fall, Chamberlain resigned and the nation turned to Churchill to rescue their cause. He resisted all appeals to negotiate a surrender or peace agreement with Hitler, stiffening the resistance and guiding the rearmament of his nation, even as they endured battlefield defeats and nightly bombings. He was able to arrange American assistance until Pearl Harbor, when America fully entered the war as Britain's ally. 5 long years of struggle brought the unconditional surrender of first Germany and then Japan. Ironically, after all their suffering, the British people voted Churchill out of office in the summer of 1945. He discerned sooner than most the threat of Soviet communism and alerted America to the looming Cold War in his famous speech in 1946, describing the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe. Churchill returned to office as Prime Minister for a brief period in the 1950s and then retired for good. He died at the age of 90. Ronald Reagan was born to lower middle-class parents in small-town Illinois. After college, he was hired as a radio broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs, and one spring, while in California for training, he was offered a Hollywood screen test. That led to a career in film, appearing ultimately in 53 movies. He was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild, and although he was a Democrat, he became alarmed at the growth of communist sympathy in Hollywood, which began his move towards conservatism. Reagan landed on the national political scene as an advocate for failed Republican candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964. He was elected governor of California in 1966 and served 2 terms, then ran against sitting President Gerald Ford for the party's nomination in 1976 and barely lost at the convention. 4 years later, he was elected in 1980 to succeed Jimmy Carter. Inheriting an economic recession and record inflation, and an America that was retreating on the global stage, he turned the nation around, bringing about a strong economy and a rebuilt military. In one-on-one confrontations with the Soviets at summit meetings, he maintained the pressure on their failing economy. His successor, George Bush 41, presided over the fruit of Reagan's work, the end of the Cold War. Reagan suffered from Alzheimer's in his final years and died in 2004 at age 93. Here are the similarities I have noted between our 2 great leaders. First, both were truth tellers when few others would. Churchill spoke the truth about Hitler. Reagan insisted that rather than the mutual standoff of détente advocated by most of the foreign policy establishment, America's goal should be to defeat communism. Second similarity, both had an unshakable ideology and convictions. Third, early failures strengthened them and led to later successes. Fourth, both had a Judeo-Christian worldview. Fifth similarity, their leadership style and direction were a dramatic contrast to their predecessor. 6, they were great communicators, and their words impacted the world. A couple notable examples. In one of his first speeches to Parliament and his nation on assuming leadership, as his army was about to be backed against the sea at Dunkirk, he proclaimed, "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And in a speech in Berlin, standing with his back to the Brandenburg Gate, Reagan said, against the advice of his advisors, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Both of these historic speeches, heard in their context, send chills up our spines to this day. A seventh similarity, both Churchill and Reagan demonstrated personal resilience and courage. Both had been targets of assassins. Eighth, the political and journalistic critics of both men frequently ridiculed and dismissed them. Ninth similarity, both men exhibited remarkable humility and grace to their opponents. 10th, both maintained positive relationships with their key allies, notably Churchill with Roosevelt and Stalin, Reagan with Thatcher and Pope John Paul II. And finally, both men believed in divine providence and were convinced that they were instruments of God's purpose in their world. The two leaders were both Christians, at least intellectually convinced. There is a lack of evidence that Churchill had a close personal or devotional relationship to Christ, but he often spoke of his great purpose in fighting the war as preserving the Christian heritage and values of Europe against the godlessness and cruelty of both fascism and communism. And while his absentee parents demonstrated no more than just a cultural faith, the governess who had the greatest impact upon young Winston through his teen years was a strongly committed evangelical Christian who may have built a strong foundation for him. Reagan's mother was an evangelical Christian, and there is strong evidence that, especially in his more mature years, he came to a deep personal faith. And though he was reluctant to attend church while in the White House due to security concerns, especially after his near assassination, he regularly attended church in California, and his diaries revealed a devotion and a prayer life that he rarely spoke with others about. These two great leaders were not perfect men by any means, but nevertheless, they both possessed, in hindsight, the strength, courage, conviction, skills, and faith to achieve the great victories that have brought immeasurable good to our times. It appears that the hand of God was guiding and using them. In our final episode, we will see how God's invisible hand has moved in dramatic ways to influence a great many people towards faith, as we will consider the two greatest revivals of the past century. I'm Pastor Doug Pratt for the Life Academy.